to show you something kind of cool. Ta-da! Thank you, Brother Chris. So, what you're looking at is a wolf in sheep's clothing carrying an American flag trampling on the cross. I have so many things I could say about this. I'm not going to say them all. But I am going to say this, that when Americanism disguised as Christianity comes into conflict with Christianity, actual Christianity, Americanism disguised as Christianity almost always, and I think almost inevitably, wins. And that makes me very sad. And it also makes me very sad because I've kind of honestly lost a lot of faith in my fellow American Christians over the last several years. I've seen American Christianity disguised as Americanism disguised as Christianity triumph so outrageously, so victoriously, that sometimes it makes me wonder if there's any gospel left. But I don't wonder that for too long, because the world is full of Christians doing gospel work in the world, not confusing their country with their gospel, not confusing their own fear and weakness and ineptitude, their own need for a strong man on their side, not confusing all of that with God. There's plenty of them out there. Just look, and you'll find them. They're all over the place. They really are. Unfortunately, they're not the ones making a whole lot of noise. Or there aren't as many of them? I don't know. Anyway, there is still good news. This isn't the end of the story. Hello, Father Sean here, and I get to talk to you about the readings for the second Sunday after Epiphany in Year B. Those readings are from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 10 and 19, Psalm 40, verses 1 through 3 and 7 through 11, and the epistle is from 1 Corinthians 6, verses 13 through 20, and the gospel is John chapter 1, verses 35 to 42. Of course, you know I'm going to say it. Please read all of those readings for yourself. It will repay you well, I promise. I'm not going to read all of them in this video, but I'll read some of the lesson from 1 Samuel and the epistle. The lesson is a really interesting reading because it shows us, first of all, it shows us a more primitive time in Israeli religious observance than what we're used to thinking of, at least what I'm used to thinking of. I think of the Jews as having the temple at Jerusalem, and it's a great, glorious thing with many rules and regulations. And here we see a very primitive version of that. The Ark of the Covenant, which was a box made out of wood covered in gold, in which were reminders of the covenant relationship between God and the people, the 10 Commandments and the manna, some of the manna in a little pot, and Aaron's staff. The Ark of the Covenant was kept in a tent for a long time, and then was kept in a tent on the move for a long time, and then was settled down in a kind of a permanent, semi-permanent structure, and that's where we find it. This is quite a bit before the building of the glorious Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And the boy Samuel, who had been given by his mother to the worship of God because he had been a miracle baby, he was ministering to the Lord under Eli. Eli is the prophet priest in charge of the temple. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. At that time Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down within the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. See, in the temple of Solomon, I'm sure that there were no little boys sleeping in the Holy of Holies where the ark was kept. This wasn't going to happen. This is much earlier and much more primitive, much more relaxed. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel," and he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down, and the Lord called again, "Samuel." And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Now, I want to stop here for just a second. I've heard preachers and teachers speak about this passage and mock Eli, deride Eli for not immediately understanding that it was the Lord calling Samuel. I mean, after all, he could have just turned to the first book of Samuel and read it there, and he would have known. It says so right in the Bible. But, when Eli was living his life, he wasn't living his life in the Bible. He was just living his life. He was just a guy. He was trying to sleep. This kid kept interrupting him, waking him up. Very annoying. He had no reason whatsoever to think that God was calling the child. No reason at all. And modern people who have the benefit of reading the Bible and knowing the storyline and knowing what comes next, we certainly have no business patting ourselves on the back and saying, "Oh, I am spiritually so superior to poor little Eli because I read the book and I know what happens next." And Eli, dumb Eli, he didn't bother reading the book. No, be kind. Be kind to people in history and in stories. They don't know what's coming up. They're just going through their lives, okay? So if by chance you happen to be one of the preachers who has mocked Eli for not figuring it out sooner, shame on you. Stop that. Okay? Then Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down. And if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood forth, calling as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for thy servant hears." And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. It's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful passage in which Samuel received the first calling from God. He eventually wound up a prophet and had a very important role to play in Israel's religious and political life. Very important role to play in the political life. Yes, indeed. And that happened because he allowed God to use him, and because God, for whatever reason, who knows why, chose to use him. It's important to notice that Samuel was not special. It wasn't that God said, "I'm going to speak to Samuel because I love him, and I don't love any of these other Goombas, so I'm not going to bother talking to them." God doesn't talk to his prophets for their sake. He talks to his prophets for the sake of of his plan, working his plan out for, in the Old Testament, for the sake of his people. And we as Christians understand that that plan, even the plan for his people, is worked out for the world. God's plan is ultimately for all of the world, all of his people, not just for a limited group. God didn't call Moses to lead the people out of Egypt because Moses deserved special treatment. He didn't call Isaiah to be a prophet because he liked Isaiah. He didn't exalt King David as king because he thought David would look really cool with a crown on his head. All of these people were used by God, tools for another purpose. Moses' relations with God weren't for Moses' sake. David's, Isaiah's, Samuel's relations with God were not for their own sake. It was for the sake of the people whom God was working with, saving, redeeming, guiding, growing for a purpose. Very important, very important. I know it's easy for us Christians to sometimes think that I'm holy and righteous and God will speak words of prophecy through me because God values me. We never say that in words, of course. We don't do that. But sometimes we think it. Sometimes priests think, this is embarrassing even to say, sometimes priests think, I have a special relationship with God because of what I get to do at the altar. And on the one hand, yeah, it's literally true. I do, in fact, have a special kind of relationship with God and a special kind of relationship with what happens at the altar. But that relationship is the relationship of a functionary. I'm not the intended recipient of that relation, of that specialness, except insofar as I'm part of the people of God. The thing that God does through me at the altar with the bread and the wine is not done because he loves me more than anybody else or because I'm special. It's because I happen to have the good fortune of being his tool for a particular purpose. And it's interesting because I might celebrate the Holy Eucharist and consecrate the body and blood of Christ and give it to somebody in the congregation who is God's tool for a different purpose, and who might find herself thinking, I am special because God uses me in this way, when in fact it's not because she's special, it's because God wants to maybe, let's just keep things simple, wants to bless me. So God uses me as his priest to give her communion, and then he uses her in whatever way to give me a blessing and other people a blessing. But that blessing isn't for her sake, it's for my sake. The communion that I give her isn't for my sake, it's for her sake. Samuel's calling in the temple wasn't for Samuel's sake, it was for Israel's sake. God's calling to Israel was not for Israel's sake, but for the world's sake, for the church's sake, let's say. Let's keep this chain going farther. God's calling of the church is not for the church's benefit, but for the benefit of all the world. Everybody who can receive the blessing. Step by step, from person to organization to group to person to whatever, the blessing finds its place, but it's not intended for any of the tools along the way. They're not special. We're not special. I'm not special. You're not special. Just like Samuel. Samuel was sleeping in the temple, but that didn't mean that God loved him more than anybody else. It meant that he had been given to God by his parents to use, and God used him. Amazing things happen through my hands, through my words, because I'm a priest. It's got nothing to do with me in any way, shape, or form. It has everything to do with the person to whom God is giving the blessing. Okay? So that was not at all what I was planning to say. I have to tell you, by the way, this is the second of these videos I've made for these readings. The first one was so awful that I wrestled and fought with myself and finally decided, no, this just got to go in the trash. This is garbage. So I worked out a completely different thing, push record, and what I just said had really very little, if anything, to do with what I had originally planned to talk about. But I'm going to let it stand, and I hope that it benefits you. Now, I'm going to do a quick little aside real fast before I end. And the gospel has this beautiful story of some of the disciples of John who witnessed John's baptism of Jesus and heard what John said to and about Jesus. They followed Jesus. And Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What do you seek?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you going? Where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and see." They came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. So, this is St. Andrew. This is an icon of St. Andrew. It's not actually the saint himself, except you can see the saint through it. You can see Christ, whom the saint carries through the icon. He's often called St. Andrew the first called because he is the first apostle, who then in his turn called his brother Peter. So he's also the first person to bring somebody to Christ. And I have the great pleasure of having had him as my patron saint since before I was born, since the day the doctor called my mother while she was at choir practice and said to her, my memory of what I was told was he said to her, "Jean, I've got news for you. You're not getting sick in the mornings. You're getting morning sickness. You're pregnant." And she said, "No, that's not possible." And in the background, the choir was singing hymn 566 in the hymnal, which has as verse 2, "As of old, St. Andrew heard it by the Galilean lake." So anyway, he's my best friend. It's been my best friend forever and ever. That's why I carry his name, and he's been praying for me forever. So every time his reading comes up, I have to share it, even though it's a complete sidetrack from what the actual talk was. Spend time quietly in the temple with God. By the way, St. Paul says that your body is the temple. Spend time quietly in your body with God. Listen for God. Listen for God's calling for you. Whatever he calls you for, please don't make the mistake of thinking it's all about you, because it's not. It's all about whomever God intends to serve through you. Say yes. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And then say yes to whatever it is he tells you to do. And then be used. Okay? Be used. And then you too can be a saint, like St. Andrew. You too can be Christ for the world, like Christ on the cross. Say yes. Say yes. Speak.